Week's 48 Hours involves a highly respected police detective who became a prime suspect in his wife's death. Amy Fanion was found dead in her Massachusetts home in May 2018. Her husband, Detective Brian Fanion, told police it was a self-inflicted gunshot wound, but investigators did not believe his story.
She sends her daughter a goodnight text. Nothing unusual, just a mother checking in before bed. 12 hours later, she's on the dining room floor. A single bullet wound to the head. Her husband kneeling over her body, calm, steady, already talking. She did this to herself, he says. He should know. He spent 30 years working murder scenes exactly like this one. Except this time, he's not the detective. He's the reason there's a body. And somewhere on a phone he never thought they'd check, there's proof of exactly why she had to die, and exactly when he decided it. She had no idea this was her last night. He did. He's on his knees when the first officers walk in. Not screaming, not panicking, talking. He's already explaining what happened before anyone asks him to. That's the first thing that doesn't fit. The woman on the floor isn't a stranger to him. She's his wife, married to her for 33 years. And the man kneeling over her body has spent almost that long working homicide scenes just like this one, from the other side. He knows what officers look for. He knows what questions come next. He knows, better than almost anyone else in the room, exactly what a crime scene is supposed to look like when it's staged to pass as something else. So when he tells them his wife shot herself, he says it the way a man says something he's already rehearsed. But rehearsed isn't the same as rehearsed well, because 3 days later, a state trooper will find something on his wife's skin that shouldn't be missing. And 10 weeks after that, a detective assigned to cybercrimes will open his phone and find a search history that reads less like grief and more like a plan. This is the case of Brian Fanion, a decorated detective in Westfield, Massachusetts, and his wife, Amy. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what was buried in his phone and why it took investigators 5 years to prove what that missing evidence on Amy's body already suggested in the first 10 minutes. If you want to understand how a man trained to catch killers almost became one who got away with it, subscribe now. This channel breaks down the digital trail, piece by piece, the way investigators actually built it, not the way it was reported. Because right now, in this room, only one person knows what really happened, and he's already lying to the people trained to catch him. Amy Jean Hansen was born on June 8, 1966, to Richard Hansen and Patricia Tarrant. One of 9 siblings, raised in a family that had already made a name for itself around Westfield before Amy was old enough to build her own. The Hansen girls had a reputation. Smart, warm, well-liked. Amy fit that description without ever trying to prove it. She attended Wyben Union Church, where she volunteered without being asked twice, and without needing anyone to notice she'd done it. Her faith wasn't performative. It shaped her schedule, her friendships, the quiet parts of her week nobody else saw. Outside of church, Amy spent most of her free time outdoors, hiking, kayaking, tending a garden that took up a meaningful part of her weekends. None of it was for an audience. It was simply how she preferred to spend her time. By 1985, she'd married Brian Fanion. 2 children followed, Travis and Tori. 33 years of marriage, a 200-year-old home on the edge of town, and a life that, from the outside, looked settled. The night before she died, Amy was working on a handmade gift for a friend's upcoming baby shower. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The kind of task that fills an evening without anyone thinking twice about it. That same night, she texted her daughter, Tori. Nothing significant. The kind of exchange that happens between a mother and daughter on any given Tuesday. By the next afternoon, Amy Fanion would be dead on her own dining room floor. But right now, in this chapter of her life, she has no idea what's coming. She's finishing a gift. She's checking in with her daughter. She's living the last ordinary night she'll ever have. And 33 years into her marriage, she still has no idea what her husband has already started planning. Brian Fanion didn't choose police work. He inherited it. His family had roots in the Westfield Police Department going back generations. The kind of lineage where the last name alone opened doors before a resume did. Joining the force wasn't an ambition. It was expected. He met that expectation and then some. Brian rose to detective, built a career respected enough that longtime residents describe him the same way, almost word for word. There wasn't anyone in Westfield who didn't know his name. He wasn't just a cop. He served as a deacon at Wyben Union Church, the same congregation where Amy quietly volunteered every week. Two people, same pews, same community, both seen as pillars of it. He and Amy met in 1983. She was 16. He was 19. 2 years later, in 1985, they married. Over the next 3 decades, Brian built the kind of public life other officers modeled their own careers after. Trusted by colleagues, respected by the department, a known figure at every level of town life, from the force, to the church, to his own street. By the time Amy died, they'd been married 33 years. 2 adult children, a home passed down through the kind of family history that gave the whole marriage the appearance of permanence. To Westfield, Brian Fanion wasn't just a husband. He was one of the most trusted men in town, married to one of the most well-liked women in it. Which is exactly what made what came next so difficult for anyone to believe, and even harder for investigators to prove. The Fanion name meant something in Westfield long before Brian ever put on a badge. Generations of his family had served on the police force, so when he joined, it wasn't a career choice. It was a continuation. He climbed the ranks quickly and became a detective, the kind of officer other cops pointed to as proof the system worked the way it was supposed to. Ask anyone who lived in Westfield long enough, and they'll tell you the same thing. Everybody knew who Brian Fanion was. His standing wasn't limited to the department. He held a position as deacon at Wyben Union Church, the same church where Amy spent her Sundays. 2 respected figures, same community, same congregation. Years before anyone thought to ask what that overlap would eventually mean. Brian and Amy's story started in 1983. He was 19. She was 16. By 1985, they were married. What followed looked, from every outward angle, like a life built correctly. 2 children, Travis and Tori. A home with 2 centuries of history behind it. A marriage that outlasted most in town. For 33 years, Brian Fanion was Amy's husband. A Westfield detective, a church deacon, and by every visible measure, one half of a marriage other couples in town were quietly measured against. None of it explains what was already forming behind it, and none of it will matter once investigators start looking at what was on his phone. Just after noon, a 911 call comes through from a home on North Road in Westfield. The caller identifies himself as Brian Fanion. His voice is steady, almost too composed for what he's reporting. He tells the dispatcher his wife has just shot herself and asks for help to be sent immediately. Westfield police and fire arrive within minutes. Inside, they find 51-year-old Amy Fanion on the dining room floor. A single gunshot wound to the right side of her head. Brian is kneeling beside her, already certain of what happened, before a single officer has asked him to explain anything. The weapon on the scene is Brian's own department-issued service pistol. Massachusetts State Police Detective Brendan Willett arrives to examine the scene directly, and almost immediately, something about it doesn't sit right with him. In a case like this, gunshot residue and stippling, the burn pattern left behind by a weapon fired at close range, should be present on the skin near the wound. On Amy, it isn't there. There's a second detail that won't surface publicly until much later in the investigation. The bullet's trajectory was measured at a downward angle, not the flat or upward path typically seen in a self-inflicted gunshot to the head. 2 pieces of forensic evidence. Neither one fits the story Brian is about to tell. Willett doesn't say any of this out loud yet. He doesn't have to. He's already looking at a scene that doesn't match the explanation waiting for him inside that house. And in a few hours, he's going to sit across from the man who gave it to him. By 2:41 that afternoon, Brian Fanion is sitting across from Detective Willett at the State Police Barracks in Russell. He's calm, composed, a man who's conducted this exact kind of interview himself, more times than he can count, just never from this chair. His account starts small. He and Amy had been arguing, he says, about retirement, about what he wanted his life to look like once he left the department, and what she still wanted for the 2 of them. The conversation drifted to their aging dog, and whether they'd get another one. Then, according to Brian, he set his service weapon down on a hutch in the dining room and stepped away to use the bathroom. When he came back, he says Amy was standing there, holding the gun to the right side of her head. He says he tried to reach her. He says he was only 4 or 5 feet away. He says she was too quick. It's a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, delivered without hesitation. The kind of account that sounds rehearsed because it's coming from a man who knows exactly what investigators listen for. At the end of the interview, Willett asks for his phone, standard procedure for digital forensics. Brian hands it over without resistance. Then Willett shuts off the recorder. And that's when Brian says something he didn't say on the record. He tells Willett he's going to see some things on that phone, and he wants him to know before he looks that it's not what it's going to appear to be. Willett doesn't respond to that in the moment. He doesn't need to. Because whatever Brian just tried to get ahead of, it's already sitting untouched on that phone, waiting for someone to find it. Detective Tom Forrest, assigned to the Massachusetts State Police Cybercrime Unit, gets access to Brian's personal phone, his laptop, and his work computer at the Westfield Police Department. What he finds doesn't read like grief. It reads like a timeline someone built on purpose. It starts in late February. Brian is searching for a woman he'd met months earlier, on a church-sponsored trip to Mexico in December 2017. A woman from Pittsfield. The searches aren't one-off curiosity. They repeat. By early April, the searches shift in tone. Brian types a question into the browser asking whether something counts as an affair if it doesn't involve sex. 2 weeks later, he moves from justification to logistics. He spends time reading through Massachusetts divorce law, and he isn't browsing broadly. He's focused on one specific outcome. What happens to a police pension when a marriage ends? That detail matters. Brian was close to retirement. That pension represented decades of work, and investigators would later learn he'd told the Pittsfield woman directly that he was afraid of losing part of it. On April 27th, between 9:22 and 9:38 in the morning, Brian visits 5 separate web pages on gunshot residue. Not general reading, specific material, including an article titled Gunshot Residue Collection, The Decisions That Make or Break a Case, and a video breaking down what those tests actually reveal. He wasn't working any case that required that information. Nobody in his department handled gunshot residue testing. There was no operational reason for him to know any of it. On May 7th, the day before Amy dies, Brian searches how to delete his most frequently contacted numbers. Not a full reset of the phone, just the people he called the most. Then, on the morning of May 8th, while he's still sitting at his desk at Westfield Station, Brian looks up Massachusetts Medical Examiner offices and visits a page listing the units within the State Police Forensics Division. The teams that respond when someone dies, the people who process a scene, a body, and everything left behind at both. He leaves work at exactly 11:47 a.m. By lunchtime, Amy is dead on their dining room floor, laid out end to end. This isn't a man spiraling, it's a man preparing. He researched the affair before he pursued it, the divorce before he considered it, and the forensic process before he needed to survive it. He studied the exact tools that would eventually be used to convict him, and he still believed it would be enough to outrun them. Brian had described her to Willett as just a friend. The recovered data said otherwise. Investigators pulled thousands of deleted messages between Brian and the Pittsfield woman, spanning months. Not a passing correspondence. A relationship built in secret, carried out almost entirely through a phone he thought no one would ever check. The volume alone told its own story. Thousands of messages don't belong to a friendship. They belong to something both people were actively hiding. Separately, detectives sat down with her directly. While Brian minimized the relationship in his own interview, her account, paired with the deleted texts, made clear this had gone far beyond a friendship, long before May 8th. Then investigators found the message that mattered most. At 12:47 p.m. on May 8, 2018, Brian sent her a text. Amy was already dead on the dining room floor. First responders were still inside the house. The message told her not to call or text him for a while. He said he'd reach out when he could. He asked her to pray for his family. His wife hadn't been gone 20 minutes, and he was already managing what came next, not calling a lawyer, not calling his children, managing her. This is the piece of evidence prosecutors would return to again and again. Not a confession, because there wasn't one. A time-stamped message sent from his own phone, at the exact moment he was pretending to be a grieving husband. If you want to understand how cases like this actually get solved, not through a breakdown or a confession, but through digital evidence recovered piece by piece, subscribe. This channel walks through exactly how investigators build a case when the person they're building it against knows precisely how to avoid one. Because Brian didn't make a mistake by sending that text. He made a mistake by thinking no one would ever read it. Brian Fanion wasn't formally charged with murder until November 6, 2019. 18 months after Amy died, and the delay wasn't hesitation. Investigators spent that time building a case they knew would need to hold up against a defendant who understood exactly how the system worked. The next day, he stood in Hampton Superior Court and pleaded not guilty. What happened behind him in that courtroom surprised even seasoned reporters. Members of both families, the Hansons and the Fanions, sat together in support of Brian. Several of Amy's own relatives believed her death had been a suicide, and they were prepared to say so. Brian remained free on bail from that arraignment, straight through to trial. Years passed. February 2020 came and went. The case didn't reach a courtroom for trial until February 23, 2023, nearly 5 years after Amy's death. The trial ran almost a month. 40 witnesses, 15 days of testimony. The prosecution's first witness was Amy's own sister, Anna Hansen. She testified that weeks after Amy's death, Brian confided in her about a search he'd made online, one that worried him. She asked what it was. He told her it was how to make a murder look like a suicide. Those were, according to Hansen, his exact words. Under cross-examination, the defense pointed out that Detective Tom Forrest never actually located that specific search on any of Brian's devices. The words stood on their own, unverified by data, but delivered under oath, directly from Brian to Amy's own sister. The defense built their case on 2 pillars. First, Amy's documented history of anxiety and emotional volatility, drawn partly from her personal diary. Second, forensic expert Alexander Jason, who testified that Amy's thick hair could have physically blocked gunshot residue from ever reaching her skin, meaning its absence proved nothing. Jason stopped short of saying Brian was innocent. He simply argued the case shouldn't rest on that missing residue alone. In her closing argument, ADA Mary Sandstrom laid the entire digital timeline out in sequence for the jury. The affair, the pension research, the gunshot residue searches, the medical examiner search, time to the exact morning Amy died. Then she gave the jury the line that would define the case. Brian couldn't divorce Amy without it becoming public, without the community that respected him, watching that image collapse. Divorce meant exposure, but murder, in his mind, didn't have to be public at all. The jury got the case on March 21st. They didn't need long. The jury deliberated across 2 days, into the morning of March 22, 2023. They had the option to convict on second-degree murder. They didn't take it. Their verdict came back first-degree, guilty, with a finding of deliberate premeditation. That same afternoon, a Superior Court judge sentenced Brian Fanion to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence for the charge. Until that exact moment, Brian had been free. Out on bail since February 2020, living in the community he'd spent his career serving, while the case against him sat unresolved for 3 years. When the verdict was read, members of both families reacted the way people do when a belief they'd held onto for years collapses in real time. Several relatives on Brian's side, people who had shown up to every session convinced the jury would see it their way, broke down in the courtroom. Defense attorney Jeffrey Brown addressed the judge directly afterward, telling the court the jury had gotten it wrong, insisting that anyone who truly knew Brian and Amy would know he hadn't done this. The jury had already answered that, in under 2 days. Hampton District Attorney Anthony Gallooni released a statement calling Brian's actions calculated and shockingly cruel. and crediting the jury for seeing through a defense built on decades of community trust. Amy's children, Travis and Tori, have continued to live in and around Westfield in the years since, rebuilding lives that were fractured twice in a single afternoon. Their mother taken by violence, their father revealed as the reason. The case didn't stay local for long. It went on to national coverage, featured on CBS's 48 Hours and A&E's Killer Cases, cited repeatedly as one of the clearest examples of digital forensics, dismantling a defendant who understood exactly how investigations worked, and still couldn't outrun one. Amy Fanion was 51 years old, 51 years of being known, in her own town, as someone who gave more than she asked for in return. If this is the kind of case that makes you want to understand how investigators build a conviction against someone trained to avoid one, subscribe. This channel exists to walk through that process accurately, case by case, the way it actually happened. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.